Good evening. Welcome to the Women's Studies Lecture Series. I'd like to thank all of you for being here and supporting the Women's Studies program at Georgia Southwestern State University. Before we get started tonight, I want to recognize some people in the room. It is very important that you all know that the programs that are brought to you by the Women's Studies program are done without any financial support. The faculty members who help to organize various events on campus and share their expertise with us do so because they believe this is an important program. I would like to recognize the various members of our faculty who are here tonight who have helped keep this program alive for one more year. Dr. Courtney McDonald, Ms. Tanya Hughes, I don't see Dr. Paula Martin, but we will thank her anyway. And of course, tonight's speakers, Dr. Elizabeth Kuipers and Dr. Susan Bragg. I thank each and every one of you for the support you've given me and the program this year. Tonight's topic is 150 Years of Freedom, the Price, and the Politics. This program was designed to honor the sesquicentennial anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation with a focus on African American women's history. I will introduce both of our speakers and then we will have time for questions for both of the speakers after their talks. Dr. Elizabeth Kuipers is an associate professor of English and bravely chairs the Department of English and Modern Languages. She earned her PhD from Auburn University. Currently, her research is focused on the 18th and 19th century and breast cancer and Native American women in literature. I asked each of our speakers what they would like for young feminists to know. Dr. Kuipers responded in a manner typical of her usual good humor, saying, "Feminists can wear lipstick and bras and not betray feminist ideals if you want to." I wholeheartedly embrace that sentiment. And her topic tonight, which is What She'd Go and Do That For, Margaret Garner's Literary Legacy. Dr. Susan Bragg holds a PhD from the University of Washington and serves the Department of History and Political Science as an assistant professor. Her current research is focused on how gender ideologies have shaped civil rights activism in the 20th century, and she is particularly interested in the history of the NAACP. In response to my question about what she would like for young feminists to know, Dr. Bragg responded through the lens of her research agenda, saying, "Women have to stand up and help define notions of rights for themselves and for other women. Without women's activism, we have a limited view of what freedom means." Therefore, her topic tonight is one she says is near and dear to her heart. Dr. Bragg's title is More Than a Seat on a Bus: Race, Gender, and Sexuality in Civil Rights Politics. Dr. Kuipers?
All right, let me see if I'm working. Thank y'all for coming out tonight. It's a real pleasure to see all of you here, and especially to see the very mixed group of people we have here. I know some of you are here, shall we say, under duress, and we will try to make this, I will try to make this as little painful as possible. The thing that I'm going to talk to you about tonight is sort of a conglomeration of texts that are about this woman, Margaret Garner. Our setting is 1850, and, well, that's a little bit predates our setting. 1850 was when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed, all right? I'm yelling, right? You can hear me way loud. Okay, the Fugitive Slave Act changed the face of attempting to escape from slavery. Up to that point, if you got to the Ohio River in America and could get across the Ohio, you were free and nobody could do anything about it, right? So Cincinnati, Ohio is at one of the least wide places of the Ohio River, and this was a wonderful place for slaves to slip from Kentucky into Ohio, and when they got there, they were free. The Fugitive Slave Act was federal legislation that made it illegal for anyone to help slaves at all escape. So now if you're in Ohio and you're a member of the Underground Railroad, which y'all all know about, right, it's all of a sudden illegal to provide clothing or food or shelter to anybody who is a former or an escaped slave. Right, so this incident is a historical incident that I want to tell you about, but that involves Margaret Garner, and she and her family choose to do just that, across the Ohio from Kentucky into Cincinnati. Now, Cincinnati at the time is a bustling metropolis, right? I don't think of Cincinnati as this huge, great, wonderful place to be. At the time, it was the 6th largest city in America, right? There was an enormous amount of trade happening there. They had a very large population of freed African Americans, but they also have this large population of escaped slaves who got there and were safe and didn't have to keep going. They also have a fairly large immigrant population, which is causing some interesting tensions between those two communities, just like it does for us now in terms of jobs, right? Who's going to get the jobs? Who's going to get the low labor job, the high labor job, low wage jobs that nobody wants? So there's a great deal of societal tension in Cincinnati about that. Margaret Garner lives in Kentucky. Her slave owner, her owner is Archibald Gaines, right? Archibald Gaines owns Margaret, and she has 4 children, kind of stair steps going down. The first one is described as being a very black child, right? Pretty sure that Margaret's first child is indeed the child of Margaret's husband, who is named John, who lives at a neighboring plantation. They were married as slaves could be. They were allowed time to visit one another and see one another. That first child, we're pretty sure is his. Our historian, let me tell you what his name is, Stephen Weissenberg, has worked really hard to prove that the next 3 children probably were not John's children. Right? We don't know whose children they were, but this becomes an important issue as we look at some of the happenings here. The children after that first one are described as Lightmulatto. The youngest one, they take careful pains to describe in newspaper articles that this child is so white you can see the blush on its cheek. Right? So there's very much that racial dynamic going on. Margaret, the children, John and John's parents all decide it's time to escape. Sunday mornings, Saturday nights were typically, they were a good time to try and escape, right? Because if your slave owner was remotely nice, he allowed you a little bit of freedom to go visit family, to go to church services, that kind of thing. So indeed, they choose a Saturday night. They choose a Saturday night that is particularly freezing cold. It's January 26th, 1856. It has been so cold that the Ohio River is frozen solid. All right, so this is going to make getting across the Ohio a whole lot easier, right? You don't have to swim, you just walk across. Well, they steal a sleigh driven by some horses, and the 4 children, Margaret, her husband, and his parents escape into Cincinnati. There's a lot of discussion about what happened next. We're not exactly sure how it all played out. Because slaves were not really given a legal voice, we don't have anything recorded from her perspective, at least not that has surfaced at this point. Margaret Garner and her family go to the house of Margaret's cousin, who is a free man in Cincinnati, and his name is Joe Kite. Joe Kite, and they get to his house sometime late in the night or early morning. Joe Kite leaves the house, and the speculation is that he is going to try and find the most famous Underground Railroad guy who is there, whose name is a white man named Levi Coffin, who's in charge kind of the Underground Railroad. Levi will get them out of Cincinnati and to someplace safer. As Joe Kite is returning to his cabin, his small house, late that morning, they are looking from inside the cabin. They're looking out the windows, and they see right behind him Archibald Gaines and the son of John and his parents' master and a posse, who clearly the game is up, right? They know where they are. So Margaret and her family, they board the windows, they block everything. Joe, her husband, has a gun, and he's going to use it. He is not going to go back, right? So a gun battle ensues. Ultimately, the only person who is injured in the gun battle is one of the deputies, a white man who's kind of shot through the cheek. It shatters his jaw, but he's not killed. He's okay. They break down the door and wrest the gun away from Joe and walk back into a back room. And in that back room, they find Margaret. I'm going to read to you what they find. I'm going to read a newspaper report. This is from the Cincinnati Enquirer. Then their eyes took in the interior tableau. A deed of horror had been consummated, for weltering in its blood, the throat being cut from ear to ear and the head almost severed from the body, upon the floor lay one of the children of the younger couple, a girl 3 years old, while in the back room, crouched beneath the bed, two more of the children, boys of 2 and 5 years, were moaning, the one having received 2 gashes in its throat, the other a cut upon the head. As the party entered the room, the mother was wielding a heavy shovel, and before she could be secured, she inflicted a heavy blow with it upon the face of the infant, which was lying upon the floor. Right, so we have 2 boys who she has attacked with a knife, with a butcher knife. They're hiding under the bed. They're not terribly wounded. She's got the one daughter who has been decapitated virtually by this butcher knife, and then the baby she's trying to bash in her brains with a shovel. Right, so immediately, probably you're going, holy cow, why did she do that? Right, and that's what the whole country started asking. What in the world was going on with this woman? What would drive a woman to kill her own children? As you can imagine, abolitionists and pro-slavers took this and used it like crazy, right? So the pro-slavers, what do you think their argument's going to be? I'm asking that rhetorically because there are too many of you. The argument would be, look, she's an animal, right? We're right to treat slaves the way they do because they're inhuman. They can't take care of themselves. They'll murder their own children. Right? Abolitionists take that and say, this woman was so abused in slavery, she had such a terrible experience that she was willing to kill her children rather than have them taken back into slavery. That second part is the part I want to focus on in the rest of my discussion. Let me find my little clicker here. Okay, this is a painting, or an engraving that was done and circulated all over the country. It appeared first in a newspaper, but then began circulating in popular magazines like Harper's Weekly, and that's where this is from. Mathew Brady took a picture of the engraving, and the picture is actually what was circulated. Do you know who Mathew Brady is? I know y'all do. Mathew Brady later became famous for his absolutely unflinching photographs of Civil War battlefields. Right? Anytime you see an image from the Civil War, just about any time, where it's real dead bodies bloated in the sun, that's Mathew Brady. Right? So he's definitely he's an abolitionist in his politics. So this is what we have as our visual representation. You can see we've got a couple of kids. We've got a kid over here. It's kind of hard to see. Not sure if this is the one that's decapitated or just one that's out cold. Got a kid hanging on here. Margaret Garner is clearly pointing to what she's done, right? And she's pointing it out to the posse. These 2 guys in the middle are the posse. This is the son who is John's master's son. And this is Archibald Gaines. All right, look at the way that he's reacting to what's going on. All right, what seems to be his reaction there? Shock, certainly. Right, he seems a little horrified. The actual charges against Margaret Garner were molded somewhat around Archibald Gaines's reaction. He was absolutely horrified at what happened, and he wept copiously over this little girl that had been decapitated, held her to him. Late the next night, was seen on his horse riding out of town with the baby's body shrouded up, still crying just as hard as he could cry. Okay? The modern Medea comes in here. Do you remember what Medea did? Do you remember who Medea is? I got a couple of vague nods. All right, Medea is married to this guy named Jason. And they have kids together and everything's great until Jason finds that he wants to be with someone else. And some of the reasons might be that this someone else he wants to be with is more racially pure than Medea. Excuse me. To ensure that Jason doesn't abuse the children or do anything terrible to the children, Medea kills them all. Right? And she is held up as a tragic heroine in ancient literature because this is seen as a self-sacrificing effort on her part. So you can see with this title of this lithograph and this print, The Modern Medea, it's automatically spinning the interpretation of this so that you're sympathetic to Margaret Garner. So that you say, this isn't a terrible thing that she did because it was heroic and self-sacrificing. Right? Look at what she was willing to take away from herself in order to save her children. The political aftermath of everything that happens here is pretty dicey. There are two laws that are at stake. One law is a state's law about property rights. If you consider a slave property, right, then you're going to your attitude is not going to be that that property can, there's just no nice way to say this. If your slave kills another slave and you think that they're property, that's destruction of property, that's not murder. Right? As horrible as that sounds, it's not a felony murder because they're just destroying, they're beating up your car, they're just destroying your property. So depending on what your attitude is towards slaves dictates pretty considerably what legal recourse should happen. There's a jurisdictional fight going on. If we're going with the state laws about property, then the state courts want her, the state deputies want her. If we're going with a federal law about murder, the feds want her. Literally, two groups of law enforcement officers are fighting over the physical bodies of these people who are left because they're trying to make their political agenda more important than the other ones. Right? Let me see what I'm forgetting. Okay, the murder trial, and there's a very quick. For the state property laws, almost always the slaves in Cincinnati were remanded to their owners very quickly. Usually the trials were just a couple of hours, if that. The trial ended up being a couple of days for this property suit, and so they decided that was a bonus, a good thing. Her lawyer was a man named Jolliffe, and he was absolutely one of the most in the forefront of the news abolitionist lawyers that there was in the day. He took the case, and the fact that it lasted more than a few hours, they felt like was good. She ultimately got remanded to Archibald Gaines' custody, and he took her back to Kentucky. The murder aspect of the trial that we need to think about, her motive, she says that her motive in killing the child is cruelty at the hands of Archibald Gaines. Right? Because of this whole Medea and the mother question, And because of his reaction, his overwhelming grief, everybody's reading that as this was Archibald Gaines's kid that she just killed and she's showing to him and that he's grieving over. And probably these other mulatto kids are his too. So if that's the case, if she's not only had all of the horrors that we normally associate with slavery, but has been for years repeatedly sexually abused by her master, what kind of things can she expect for her daughter? The same kind of life, right? So if you layer a defense with all of those kinds of explanations, it makes her a little bit more, makes people more sympathetic to her. All right, there was also another question in this very complicated trial about whether or not they were even slaves. Apparently at the time, if you went from Kentucky to Cincinnati, even if you were with your owner, Cincinnati was a free state, Ohio was free, and people could argue in court that they were free because they had been on free land, even if they went back to the slave-holding state. So Jolliffe argued that Margaret and all of her children were free because before she had her children, she visited Cincinnati and then went back and had her children. As you probably know then, the law was that children followed the condition of the mother, right? It didn't matter who the father was and whether he was free or not, it just mattered about the mother. So if she was free before she even had these children, then the state property laws were just not even at question. So these were some of the multiple layered problems, let's say, with this legal battle. Okay, in the final days of her trial, Lucy Stone, who was a very eloquent, famous suffragist and orator for suffrage at the time, went and visited Margaret in jail and had a long conversation with her that was not recorded. But then Lucy couldn't do anything. Women's voices were not even valued in the court at this time, but she begged to please have a part of the closing arguments. And in the closing arguments, one of the things that she said was that she would rather rip open her wrist with her own teeth and shed her blood, her own blood and the blood of her children before letting them go back into slavery. So this adds another layer of this heroic woman image that is being perpetrated. This is going to seem kind of abrupt, but in addition to Lucy Stone, we've got other people at the same time writing about her. Probably the most famous one is Frances Eliza Watkins Harper. Here she is. She is often considered the mother of African American protest poetry. She wrote very politically driven poetry in response to literature. You may know the Uncle Tom's Cabin, Eliza Harris, Bounds Across the River. She wrote a poem about that. This is the poem that she wrote about Margaret Garner. She's got two poems called The Slave Mother. So if you go look it up, The Slave Mother, the short one is not this one. This one is The Slave Mother, A Tale of the Ohio. I have but four, the treasures of my soul. They lay like doves around my heart. I tremble lest some cruel hand should tear my household wreaths apart. My baby girl with childish glance looks curious in my anxious eye. She little knows that for her sake, deep shadows round my spirit lie. My playful boys, could I forget, my home might seem a joyous spot, but with their sunshine mirth I blend the darkness of their future lot. And thou, my babe, my darling one, my last, my loved, my precious child, oh, when I think upon thy doom, my heart grows faint and then throbs wild. The Ohio's bridged and spanned with ice. The northern star is shining bright. I'll take the nestlings of my heart and search for freedom by its light. Winter and night were on the earth, and feebly moaned the shivering trees. A sigh of winter seemed to run through every murmur of the breeze. She fled, and with her children all, she reached the stream and crossed it o'er. Bright visions of deliverance came like dreams of plenty to the poor. Dreams, vain dreams, heroic mother, give all thy hopes and struggles o'er. The pursuer is on thy track, and the hunter at thy door. Judea's refuge cities had power to shelter, shield, and save. Even Rome had altars, 'neath whose shade might crouch the wan and weary slave. But Ohio had no sacred fane to human rights so consecrated, where thou mayest shield thy hapless ones from their darkly gathering fate. Then said the mournful mother, if Ohio cannot save, I will do a deed for freedom, shalt find each child a grave. I will save my precious children from their darkly threatened doom. I will hew their path to freedom through the portals of the tomb. A moment in the sunlight she held a glimmering knife. The next moment she had bathed it in the crimson font of life. They snatched away the fatal knife. Her boys shrieked wild with dread. The baby girl was pale and cold. They raised it up. The child was dead. Sends this deed of fearful daring through the country's heart no thrill? Do the icy hands of slavery every pure emotion chill? Oh, if there is any honor, truth, or justice in the land, will ye not, as men and Christians, on the side of freedom stand? Overtly abolitionist, sentimental poetry, trying to move the audience to have a very sentimental response to what Garner had done. There's one more novel that her lawyer wrote based on this experience that I haven't got my hands on. I haven't tried to get my hands on it, frankly. It was written in 1858, so just a year after this, and it's called Chattanooga. Apparently it's got a lot of lawyer-ese in it, so I'm not sure if you'd want to look at it. But for the next 140 years, Margaret Garner was off the radar. Right? Culturally, we did not remember her. She's not a part of history. Probably most of you had no idea of this event in history. But the beautiful, the radiant, the brilliant, the lovely, turn that back on, Toni Morrison in 1987 wrote Beloved. Right? And this novel won the Pulitzer Prize for Literature. And she was inspired by Margaret Garner's story in this story of Beloved. She says that she basically just found the bare bones outline of the story and then stopped researching so she could people the book artistically like she needed to. If you've seen the movie or read the book, Setha, the character, the mother character, is analogous to Margaret Garner. Right, you'll know that Setha escapes just as Margaret did and cuts off her baby's head with a saw, just like Margaret Garner did, just a different implement. When Setha is interrupted by the people who are coming to claim them, to take them back into slavery, this is school teacher and his nephews who are just outrageously horrible, nasty, terrible people. Setha has one baby, one of the little boys by the heel, no, the baby, the infant, by the heels, and she is swinging it to brain the baby against the wall, right? And someone steps in and intercepts the baby and catches the baby before it hits the wall. The little boys in the novel, she has knocked out with a shovel, and so the school teacher, the slave catcher, thinks they're dead, okay? What I want to focus on here is the reactions that people have in the novel to this deed, this historical incident. And the first one is when these white men come and encounter what's going on. One thing about Beloved, about Toni Morrison's fiction, is that it's stylistically challenging sometimes. So there are not necessarily direct quote markers going on, direct speech markers. So bear with me if I stumble a little bit. Inside, two boys bled in the sawdust and dirt at the feet of a nigger woman holding a blood-soaked child to her chest with one hand and an infant by the heels with the other. She did not look at them. She simply swung the baby toward the wall planks, missed, and tried to connect a second time, when out of nowhere, in the ticking time the men spent staring at what there was to stare at, the old nigger boy, still mewing, ran through the door behind them and snatched the baby from the arc of its mother's swing. Right off it was clear, to school teacher especially, that there was nothing there to claim. The three, now four, because she'd had the one coming when she cut, she's pregnant when she leaves, and she has the baby as she's trying to escape. So that's the fourth one they're talking about here. The three pickaninnies they had hoped were alive and well enough to take back to Kentucky, take back and raise properly to do the work Sweet Home desperately needed, were not. Two were lying open-eyed in sawdust. A third pumped blood down the dress of the main one, the woman schoolteacher bragged about. The one, he said, made fine ink, damn good soup, pressed his collars the way he liked, besides having at least 10 breeding years left. But now she'd gone wild, due to the mishandling of the nephew who'd overbeat her and made her cut and run. Schoolteacher had chastised that nephew, telling him to think, just think, what would his own horse do if you beat it beyond the point of education? Or Chipper, or Samson. Suppose you beat the hounds past that point that way. Never again could you trust them in the woods or anywhere else. You'd be feeding them, maybe holding out a piece of rabbit in your hand, and the animal would revert, bite your hand clean off. So he punished that nephew by not letting him come on the hunt. Made him stay there, feed stock, feed himself, feed Lillian 10 crops, see how he liked it. See what happened when you overbeat creatures God had given you the responsibility of. The trouble it was, the loss. The whole lot was lost now, 5. He could claim the baby struggling in the arms of the mewling old man, but who'd tend her? Because the woman, something was wrong with her. She was looking at him now, and if his other nephew could see that look, he would learn the lesson for sure. You just can't mishandle creatures and expect success. All right, so this is from the white man slaveholder's point of view. Pretty appalling, yes, right? It's not about Setha, it's not about the dead baby, it's about the nephew who has overbeat her and needs to learn a lesson. Right, so a competing narrative, of course, in the story is Setha's depiction of what happens. And I think that the only thing I need to tell you is that she's talking to Paul D., who has left the Sweet Home is the plantation that they were both slaves on. So he knew Setha when she was a girl, and Paul D. has come back 20 years after all of this has happened, and Setha's trying to explain to him as best she can. I couldn't let all that go back to where it was, and I couldn't let her nor any of them live under schoolteacher. That was out. Setha knew that the circle she was making around the room, him, the subject, would remain one, that she could never close in, pin it down for anybody who had to ask. If they didn't get it right off, she could never explain, because the truth was simple. Not a long, drawn-out record of flowered shifts, tree cages, selfishness, ankle ropes, and wells. Simple. She was squatting in the garden, and when she saw them coming and recognized schoolteacher's hat, she heard wings. Little hummingbirds stuck their needle beaks right through her headcloth into her head and beat their wings. And if she thought anything, it was no. No, 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 no. Simple. She just flew. Collected every bit of life she had made, all the parts of her that were precious and fine and beautiful, and carried, pushed, dragged them through the veil, out, away, over there where no one could hurt them. Over there, outside this place, where they would be safe. Right. Starkly different point of view, obviously. This is the mother trying to explain what her rationale was. So Paul D's reaction to this is not particularly comforting, right? Because what he does is chastise her for being animal-like. He says, Setha, you got 2 legs, not 4. What you did was morally wrong, right? And Setha's reaction, Paul D says to her, your love is too thick. And Setha says to him, love is or it ain't. Then love ain't love at all. And Paul D again challenges her, and she says, it ain't my job to know what's worse. It's my job to know what is and to keep them, her babies, away from what I know is terrible. I did that. The consequences of her actions in the story are that Denver, the child who's still alive, won't leave the yard, and she has nightmares of her mother coming to cut her head off. The two boys, as soon as they were able, but still really little, like 8 and 7 or something, run off, and she never sees them again. She has no idea where they are, right? And she is psychologically scarred. And Beloved, the baby, haunts the house. Until Paul D comes, she's just this spirit in the house. When Paul D comes, she shows up in a grown woman's body, and it takes Setha a while to figure out that this is her baby that she's killed. Beloved then, as a grown woman, begins to literally suck the spirit and soul out of Setha. Literally starves her with food, starves her spiritually, starves her emotionally. As this is happening, this is a really weird part. Beloved gets fatter and fatter and fatter, but it looks like she's pregnant, and there's a whole side story there I won't go into. But Denver realizes that, holy moly, this isn't workable, right? Something's got to change. So she leaves this house and goes into the community. And in the community, she finds women who are incredibly sympathetic to the horrors that she has experienced. And they come together and they help her, and they take food to Setha. And in the final scene that Beloved is in, the character Beloved is in, the women, all of these black women, have gathered, and they got their Bibles and their Sunday hats on, and they are stomping down the road. They are going to take care of this haint, right? Because they all know it's a ghost. They get there and they're singing and praising and quoting the Bible, and a white man is coming down the road in a carriage, and Setha loses it, right? She breaks, just like she did when she saw school teacher, because she thinks it's school teacher coming to get Denver and Beloved. So she grabs an ice pick and goes to attack the white man. Right? This is an important point in the novel, because instead of Setha projecting her anger and her hurt and her pain on her child, right, she shifts consciousness kind of and directs it towards the person who perpetrated all of that pain, towards this white man. Now, it's not school teacher, right? She's gone mental for a few minutes. These women embrace her. They get the ice pick away from her. They don't let her kill this white man. Beloved kind of vaporizes, pregnant, naked belly and all, just poof. You got to see it in the movie. It's crazy. And everything's not better, right? Setha still has to live with the consequences of the tragedy and the history, but the fact that she has been brought back into the community and embraced and accepted for who and what she is, she can begin to heal, right? So Morrison is working with this theory that she calls rememory, where she is attempting in most of her fiction to give women a voice again who have been denied a voice historically. Right, so in this example, we saw how Margaret Garner was denied a voice. We don't have any records about her take on what happened. All of it is fictionalized, imaginative. This is Morrison attempting to restore a voice to Margaret Garner and people her history in a way that we can understand it. And that's all I have.
Hi, everyone. I don't know that I can actually make myself heard without staying by this microphone, and I actually have some comments. I'm going to be a little bit more formal here. But I also want to thank Dr. Bryan and everyone else who is here for coming. As Dr. Bryan noted, I said this was a project that is near and dear to my heart. And I feel that way for a number of reasons, but in part because it speaks to why I am a historian. I mean, from my perspective, and I hope for my students, I don't know, but I hope my students see this, history is not something that's just sort of dead stuff in a book, right? It's real people, real lives, real experiences that helps us understand where we are today. And what I want to talk about also, hopefully, helps us understand where we're going and what issues we have to deal with. So, that is the sort of inspiration for my project tonight. More than a seat on the bus, race, gender, and sexuality in the civil rights movement. Of course, this is the sesquicentennial of the Emancipation Proclamation, the 150th anniversary of the beginnings of freedom. And we should keep that in mind. The Emancipation Proclamation started a freedom movement in many ways that we are still working on. Now, when we think about the Emancipation Proclamation, we often tend to think about those kinds of politics in very traditional ways, and of course focus on men's actions. And we think about people like Abraham Lincoln and the process of declaring emancipation. Or we think about the actions, the very important actions of African American men fighting for manhood rights, of voting, and civil protections during Reconstruction that followed. But we often forget that women are a part of the story. So, of course, I would argue generally, and particularly in this case, that if we look at history from a woman's perspective, not only do we see 51% of American life, right, a much bigger kind of view, but we also see other issues that are important to women and, of course, to society. We essentially will see new kinds of concerns about what freedom is and what our goals should be, what our expectations are, what our concerns are. So, of course, one of the issues that I want to focus on tonight is this issue of human rights, an issue particularly of rape and sexual assault. And this is a historical issue as well as a contemporary issue. Again, tracing that connection from the past to the present. Now, I actually want to make this argument to you tonight, historically, that protecting women, this is all women, protecting women from rape and sexual assault has been at the center of black female activism and has really been started in many ways by black women in American history. And we can trace this, of course, back to our colonial foundings. Now, I think Dr. Kuipers has really talked a lot about some of these issues here in the 19th century. And one of the problems that we have today is that we forget this legacy, we forget this past. We miss this history of activism against rape, for human rights, for the concern of autonomy, for bodily integrity. And in fact, when a mostly white, not entirely, but a mostly white feminist movement appeared in the 60s and 70s and began to talk about rape, everyone thought it was a new topic, right? They forgot, as others had forgotten, that African American women had made this a central platform of their civil rights activism across time. Now, in fact, those black women had not only raised that issue, but they had helped to create not just a civil rights movement, but the feminist movement that then came later, too. So we have some interesting connections here, even though they've been forgotten. So I want to sort of recover this tradition a little bit and think about this history of rape activism and civil rights politics here. And I'm going to start out with a familiar story, I think. Well, at least I'm going to tell it in a way that we think we know. And that is the story of Rosa Parks, right? Now, hopefully everyone is familiar with the idea of Rosa Parks. She sat down on the bus, right? I mean, that's the kind of story that we have. She gets tired, she sits down on the bus. Now, the storyline goes that she's a very nice lady, she's a very genteel lady, she's very respectable. She's coming home from work in Montgomery and she's tired and she decides she's had enough. She doesn't want to give up her seat to a white man, and so she sits down. And when she sits down and she gets arrested, then of course the community comes to her protection and Martin Luther King stands up and he leads the Montgomery bus boycott, right? That's the story that we've all heard? Didn't work that way. Nothing against Martin Luther King whatsoever. He's an important figure and we're going to talk about him. But there's a much deeper history if we actually think about Rosa Parks herself and her own legacy of activism here. In fact, she was actually silenced during the 1950s, a very conservative era. And she has a much more impressive legacy that we need to recover as part of our own inspiration to move forward. Rosa Parks did not sit down just so she could have a seat on the bus. She didn't sit down just because she was tired. It was a much deeper kind of human issue, a human rights concern that she had. So, the story about Rosa Parks, again, a much more interesting tale when we look at it, a much richer, fuller tale too, when we see it from her perspective. She grew up in Alabama in the 1920s and 1930s at a time when the Klan was raging again. The Klan was born in the 1860s during the Civil War and Reconstruction years. It comes back full force in the 1920s, and it's modernized, it's expanded, it's national, very, very powerful, it's urbanized. And of course, Rosa Parks grows up with this experience. She watched her grandfather sit on their porch with a shotgun, watching for people coming by the house. And as she is growing up with this kind of knowledge of her community and this recognition of these challenges and these tensions, her grandfather tells her always to stand up for herself. And her grandmother actually jokes that she was going to get lynched before she was 20 because she was so assertive. She's not just the quiet little lady who sits down on the bus, that she is standing up to power because she sees her grandfather standing up to power and she sees others standing up to power around her. So by the 1930s, when she's a very young woman, she becomes involved in civil rights activism. She first gets involved in the Scottsboro case, if you're familiar with that. But in the 1940s, during World War II, we also have the regrowth of the NAACP in the South. It had tiny little roots in World War I, but it comes roaring back in World War II as African Americans begin to say, this is the time. The Double V campaign. We're going to fight for victory overseas against the Nazis. We're going to come home and fight against Jim Crow. And Rosa Parks is at the heart of this. This is not just a male veterans movement. This is a movement in which Rosa Parks says, this is the time to stand up. So one of the things that she does, really amazing to me, again, she's not just this nice little old lady, right? She's this very powerful woman who actually travels about Alabama to rural areas where the Klan is very powerful, right? Very dangerous thing to do. And she travels about and begins to recruit people to join the NAACP, to become active in a civil rights movement, to stand up for their rights, to register to vote, to try to register to vote, really, right? And again, to stand up to power. And when she does so, she meets a woman named Ricci Taylor. In 1944, Ricci Taylor had been raped by 6 white men while she was walking home from a church service. She was walking home with a younger boy and a neighbor woman, and so there are witnesses that saw her get abducted by these men. They basically carry her off in a car, and she is repeatedly raped by these men before she's finally let go with almost no clothing left, and she has to make her way home. And they immediately take her to the police authorities, and they sort of, take some general notes and sort of put them in the round file, right? Put them in the trash can. And so, of course, this is an issue which is really going to galvanize not just local peoples, the sense of, a loss of human dignity that Ricci Taylor has suffered. But now Rosa Parks is going to say, we need to make this a larger issue. This needs to be, recognized. This needs to be acknowledged. And so with Rosa Parks at the center, we're going to see a new kind of movement that begins to appear in the 1940s. Again, it's going to be added to by black veterans as they come back, and by additional voices as we move forward into the 1950s that emphasize there needs to be some kind of self-protection, some kind of recognition of the dignity of women, that rape is a problem that black women in particular face as a kind of political terrorism, that groups like the Klan and others are abusing black women because there are no consequences. When the police themselves simply ignore you, when you are literally naked in front of them, this is a sign that you need to put pressure upon authority. So Rosa Parks would make the story of Ricci Taylor a national story, and we see all these kinds of women's groups that begin to really, become very powerful during this time period. They're writing letters to each other, they're petitioning officials, they're beginning to speak out in church groups. There's a legacy of this. We'll talk about it even more here. But they're very successful at this moment of time at creating this kind of national recognition. Now, unfortunately, that doesn't mean that Alabama cares about Ricci Taylor. And there's this very sad, sort of story with Ricci Taylor that she never gets full justice. It does become national news, but that doesn't mean local authorities in Alabama are going to respond. So I think what's going to be important about this case is that the activism itself becomes a legacy that you can use. If you don't get justice, you're going to keep coming back and working on it and pushing the message and expanding that message, and you're going to have more experience. Again, people like Rosa Parks take this into Montgomery in the 1950s. So we can see how this kind of experience really provides a foundation for later civil rights activism that is going to appear. Voter rights registration campaigns, desegregating schools, desegregating buses, all of these are important. But they come from those initial issues that women are having about basic human rights, basic bodily integrity, basic respect. So I think we can really sort of see a deeper foundation for the civil rights movement if we look at people like Rosa Parks. Now, in many ways, again, Martin Luther King has been recognized as the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott, and he was an important symbol of the bus boycott. He represented the movement to the larger nation, but it was women like Rosa Parks and many others who actually created the bus boycott and maintained it for the year. And in fact, I think that Martin Luther King himself would agree with us. This is not to put Martin Luther King down at all, to recognize he's an important leader. But his actions were actually inspired by that deeper community activism of Rosa Parks. He saw these women working, he essentially recognized their work, and he would go on essentially to try to expand that. So this is one case, again, that reminds us of the importance of these deeper humanitarian issues. And if Ricci Taylor didn't get justice, unfortunately there are a lot of other very sad stories of women who do not necessarily get justice. And I want to mention a local case here. This is the story of Rosalie Ingram, who was a sharecropper in Ellaville. In 1947, she's working on her land. She's widowed. She had 12 children, 10 who actually survived. So she has quite a load as a worker and a mother, right? But she's really responsible for this land. And an elderly white man who was a landowner nearby came onto her plot of land and tried to sexually assault her. In the conflict that emerges, she sort of cries out and tries to defend herself. Two of her very young sons also step up to try to help her. And they use these farm implements to beat this man off, and he's elderly and he dies. And so, of course, the local reaction in Ellaville is to arrest Rosalie Ingram and her two teenage sons, try them for murder, and sentence them to death in the electric chair for defending herself, right, on her own plot of land. And let me also note that there is no debate about actually what happened on that plot of land at that moment of time. All the people involved, whether they're Jim Crow officials or whether they're members of the Ingram family, recognized that this was a matter of self-defense. The question was, did African Americans have the right to self-defense? That's the question that the court is really dealing with in an informal way, right? There's a one-day trial, and then they're given this death penalty. So as with the Ricci Taylor case, it's African American women who take action. Again, African American men are there, but it's really women who are saying these are women's issues. It's a women's body who is at stake here. Her children are at stake here. We have to take action. We have to act immediately. And so they will try to, again, bring lots of press attention, to get the national media to pay attention to what's going on here in Sumter County, to be aware of these issues. Now, again, they get mixed results. They ultimately will help to both first get rid of the death penalty. They're given basically life imprisonment, and then to get a parole by 1959. Well, by this time period, I mean, this is a wonderful thing. Now they're out, but they've lost 10 years of their lives, and her young boys have spent the formative years in prison, right? And they've had this death threat hanging over them. So I think we need to be careful if we celebrate this too quickly. On the one hand, this shows us the success of women's activism, this kind of pressure that they were bringing to Jim Crow. But on the other hand, it showed the price that it also took. It showed the difficulty. And it reminds us how hard it is to create a civil rights movement, which is why we should respect that it happened, right? It doesn't just happen overnight because we all get tired and sit down, in our seats on the bus. Now, Rosalie Ingram could never even return to Ellaville. It was simply too dangerous for her there, too. She ends up staying in Atlanta. And I want to use these stories to sort of have us think in a more sophisticated, hopefully more complicated way about these traditions of social reform activism. What I think is so important and so inspiring in many ways to me personally is that African American women have really worked to define American opportunity and American freedom, not just as voting rights, not just as economic opportunity, but as human rights issues, as bodily integrity issues. And I also think that they, in doing so, have emphasized a caring ethos, an ethos that has centered women's issues and family concerns as a larger measure of progress. And I think that all of us can take lessons from this, that all of us can be inspired by this, one of the reasons why I do the work I do, but that also we, can hopefully continue this kind of activism. And I actually, again, want to even go back further for another little story here, or additional kinds of representations. In the late 19th century, after the end of slavery, of course, we have the rise of formal Jim Crow, and Georgia alone witnesses over 450 lynchings. This is just Georgia. You can imagine what's happening in Alabama, Mississippi, and so on and so forth, right? So African Americans lose voting rights. African Americans lose any kind of representation in their communities. They lose public privileges like, meaningful education, all the way down to even paving in the streets, right? You're going to see an extensive kind of inequality that expands. Now, this is a kind of history that hopefully we know a little bit of, and hopefully we're also interested in exposing or recognizing to a greater degree. What we also have to recognize is, again, is this problem of, rape, of sexual assault really is at the heart of the exploitation of Jim Crow, the power of Jim Crow. And I'm actually going to show you just one record, and it's a fairly lengthy one, and all I want is basically for us to look and think about what this means here. Oh, that's another one. That wasn't what I was expecting. But speaking to Dr. Kuipers, speaking about the traditions of female activism, I guess I'm a little ahead. But this is, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who emphasizes, again, these bodily issues, these human rights issues through the eyes of women, bringing that caring ethos, bringing that humanitarian ethos to concerns about what freedom should be. And this is just a little part of her, so I highly recommend check out some of her poetry. But this is what I was expecting to have come up. This is from the Georgia Freedmen's Bureau records. This is just one little example. You can find lots and lots of others. I just picked this one almost at random. There were so many to choose from, unfortunately. I think this is a kind of evidence. When we read individually, of course, it reminds us of the horrors of the time. But it also reminds us of the challenges of a civil rights movement in the 19th century. That this is, again, not just a movement for male voting rights. It's not just a movement to get, better opportunities to compete economically in a city, to be a farmer. There are some much deeper issues here. Now, I know this is really big, but just sort of, thinking impressionistically. This tells us about the power of Jim Crow, a power to inflict violence on peoples in a very everyday kind of way. And again, this is just one of many. Literally, you can Google Freedmen's Bureau records and come up with hundreds and hundreds of these kinds of cases. And almost entirely, they end like this one. Is this any kind of victory that we're going to get for this woman? Attackers reside in Calhoun County, and that is it, right? That this is an assault that has happened, and there will be no justice for this woman. So I know that's pretty lengthy and long, but again, I want us to sort of get a sense of the difficulties of creating a civil rights movement, and then these other issues that shape a civil rights movement. And that should help us appreciate the kind of female activism. When women speak out, they know what can happen to women who do speak out sometimes. That you can be abused, you can be exploited. And at a time when African American leaders in the late 19th century, like Booker T. Washington and many others, often advocated for compromise, we actually have a tradition of African American women who do speak out despite these kinds of experiences. Women like Ida B. Wells Barnett, who will protest lynching, even though she is threatened with lynching many a time and actually has to leave the South. Nannie Helen Burroughs was a teacher in Washington, D.C., who created schools for black women, and her slogan was, "To thine own powers appeal." That's a very feminist kind of statement, I think. To thine own powers appeal. African American women by 1896 would create a network of clubs and organizations that would help them promote this issue of dignity, of respect, of opportunity for women. So here is Nannie Helen Burroughs, a Baptist activist. She was the leader of the Baptist Women's Auxiliary, one of the largest groups of the late 19th century. This is actually probably larger than the early NAACP would be in the 20th century. So this is an important legacy we often forget. When we talk about civil rights activism, we talk about groups like the NAACP, rightfully so, but we have these female organizing traditions that come out of very difficult situations, but also represent these larger messages. And they spoke out at a time when, for women, speaking out was particularly difficult. Black women have to face the stereotypes of being the mammy figure, or the sexualized Jezebel, a prostitute kind of figure, or a sapphire. And a sapphire is a woman who is uppity, she's brassy, she's bossy. So for women to speak out, they get lots of criticism from, mainstream Americans, as well as from black ministers and other black political leaders. Nannie Helen Burroughs, in fact, complained, "The sisters have been hindered from helping because of these notions about women's status." And yet, they do continue to speak out. Here we have Anna Julia Cooper, who was a club woman and one of the first African American women to earn a PhD. She earned a PhD in literature and French at the Sorbonne, and she spoke out against rape. And I think her statement here is very powerful. "Only the black woman can say when and where I enter in the quiet, undisputed dignity of my womanhood, without violence and without suing or special patronage, then and there the whole Negro race enters with me." If that's how we center a civil rights movement, that's a much more humanitarian ethos, a much deeper kind of ethos for creating social justice. And of course, right down here is the slogan of the African American Club Women's Network, "Lifting as we climb," basically promoting uplift, but bringing others along with us, not emphasizing competition, but instead emphasizing that kind of caring, that kind of connectivity that is so important. Not to suggest they didn't have tensions and they didn't argue, but at the same time, there is this deeper foundation that I would think is important. So this is a legacy, I think, that is important that we should recognize and respond to. And I'm not just here because I want to tell you something that maybe you didn't know about, but there's also a political problem with this. Because it was considered unseemly by the mainstream public and even by the black male political leadership for women to speak out, women's voices were often ignored. They were shunted aside. They were, dismissed. And of course, when we dismiss those women's voices, we dismiss the issues of rape and sexual assault. Those were not being raised by other groups, by other leaders. So we have to have women like Anna Julia Cooper who talk about human dignity, who talk about lifting as we climb, or else we don't respond to these issues. So I think that's very important for us today. To accomplish a human rights vision, we need to build upon this legacy, and we need to find inspiration for it, and we need to be more inclusive as we move forward. We need to think about these kinds of broader issues and not assume that our issues will be talked about by others. In this day and age, when politicians are trying to define what a real rape is without talking to women, right? When young women are assaulted and exploited at vulnerable moments, and those moments are posted on YouTube or on Twitter, we need, as a group, to stand up for social justice. We need to lift as we climb. We need to represent that caring ethos. We need to represent the dignity of the human spirit. So, history is political here, right? It is very contemporary. Now, Of course, it's very easy to blame the victim, and we all know that, right? And this is what these women were trying to move us beyond. That we have to, again, lift as we climb. We have to recognize issues across experiences. As the stories of club women like Anna Julia Cooper, Rosa Parks, the women who sought to free Rosalie Ingram tell us, it was African American women's organizations that really sought to keep these issues in the public eye. They sought to emphasize, they sought to articulate these issues. And so I actually think we need to encourage women's groups specifically to speak up, to identify their concerns, and to express these issues. And so I'm going to make you sort of do something that might seem very cheesy here. Please bear with me. I actually think that we have a tradition we can build on this campus. I think that's important to recognize. I think, again, we need to lift as we climb. So we have groups like Suave. Anyone here from Suave? Anyone here a member? Stand up. I'm putting you on the spot. You're going to be joined by others. Zeta Phi Beta. Anyone here a member of Zeta Phi Beta? Thank you. Stand up. Quake, Queens and Kings of Equality. Stand up. Now, these are all groups that are networking, and I'm putting them on the spot first, but I'm going to get to the rest of you here, right? But these are all groups that are networking for, social justice issues, not just partying on a Friday night. Nothing wrong with that, right? As long as you're doing other stuff, you have these humanitarian concerns. These are all groups that center women's issues as well as broader humanitarian issues. And note, I started out with women's groups, but we also have mixed groups as well, basically Queens and Kings of Equality, all standing for these human rights issues. And I think that we should recognize other kinds of traditions. We have lots of female clubs and sorority networks. If you're a member of a club or a sorority or a fraternity, please stand up. I know I'm being cheesy, but come on, you gotta all join in. Now, this is just a start. I actually suspect there's probably a lot more we can go on here. But let me just note that when we are organizing, again, we organize for fun, we organize for personal opportunity, but we also organize and we talk to each other, and hopefully we center human rights issues. At some point, we care about those issues. I know you're in a group, Abby. You stand up. You're in the African Student Association. Stand up. I really put people on the spot when I can, right? But this is a positive development. Whatever our issues are, we should also recognize this broader context. This much more important issue at the heart is human dignity. If women's groups started this, then hopefully we are all much more aware and much more sensitive now. And we need to move towards that so we don't blame the victims, that we watch out for other people. And you can all sit down now. Thank you very much. I'm going to do one more cheesy little thing. Now, I have one last story to sort of let us sort of move out on, and that's the story of Joan Little. Oops, another one I forgot I had in there, reminding us about the importance of women in the civil rights movement, women in Albany. We have a strong local legacy here. There we go. Oops. Now what did I do? Maybe can you help make it to the last one? Thank you. Anyway, so I'll just go on ahead. So we have Joan Little, who was imprisoned in North Carolina in 1975. And she was imprisoned for basically charges of shoplifting. While she's imprisoned, her jailer attacks her, and she ends up taking the ice pick that he had brought into her cell to force her to have sex with him against him, and she kills him. And of course, what happens? She's tried for murder, right? He's dead with his pants off in the jail cell, and she's tried for murder because she's tried to defend herself. And so it took a feminist movement of both black women and white women to help free Joan Little. And I want to play for you a song here that represents this movement and this ethos, and I hope that you all listen to these ideas and then think more broadly. Of course, we talk about rape at home, and of course we've been hearing about rape abroad. This is not just some people's issue. It's not just one community's problem. It's not an American problem. It's a global concern. And I would also point out that when we talk about rape and sexual assault as terrorism, as violence, as human rights issues, we should recognize it's not just a women's issue. Rape happens to men. Sexual assault happens to men. And this is the kind of message that African American women were seeking to get out more broadly. By centering on women's issues, we could explore this problem much more broadly. So, see if we can get up that. Don't let my music section here.
She's your lover, your answer woman who's gonna carry your time. I always been told since the day I was born, leave them no good women alone. Keep your nose clean, keep your butt off the street. You gon' be judged by the company you keep. I always walk by the golden rule. Steer clear of controversy, I stayed real cool. Along came this woman, not even 5 feet tall, charged in jail with breaking the law. And the next thing I heard, as it came over the news, first degree murder, she was on the loose. Tell me, is it good? I'm gonna say to you, go and little, she's my sister. Joe and little, she's our mama. Joe and little, she's your lover. Joe and the woman who's born to carry your time. Now I ain't talking about the rolling west. This was 1975 and it's most of President's death. North Carolina state, oh the pride of this land. I made her an outlaw, hunted on every hand. Tell me what did she do to deserve this name? She killed a man who thought that she was fair game. When I heard the news, I screamed inside. I lost all my cool, my anger, I could not hide. 'Cause I'm Joanne is you, Joanne is me.
So we got the point. I know that the sound didn't get all the way up maybe to the tops as much as we might, but that was Sweet Honey in the Rock, a women's singing group that was really instrumental to the civil rights movement in the 60s and 70s and is still around to this day, so you might check them out if you're so interested. But I also hope, again, that gives us a sense of the importance of history that we can actually continue on, that we can build upon, that history is usable to us, and that we are inspired by it, because I know I am myself. So, thank you very much.
Does anybody have any questions for either of our speakers? Wonderful. Okay, we'll need to mic you guys or bring you up here so that our TV cameras, yes, you're live and on television, so that our TV camera can get your responses. Dr. Ohl?
My question is for Liz. Did everyone hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I was here. Okay, so you talked about the outcome of Margaret Garner's property, or no, she had to be returned to Kentucky, but you never said what happened. Was she found guilty of murder? Was it property destruction? I'm on the edge of my seat.
I am so sorry. How did I miss that?
No.
Archibald Gaines said that he sold her downriver. Nobody knows anything that happened to her. They couldn't find her. They couldn't physically find her to prosecute the murder trial. say that she goes downriver with the infant that she had that she didn't manage to kill, and someone says that, some rumor, that she jumped overboard as she's on the boat going downriver. Because, going downriver, slavery got worse and worse and worse and worse the farther it went. That she jumped over and with her baby, and they grabbed her and pulled her back up, but not the baby, so that the baby drowned, but she was saved. But that's all rumor and speculation. We have no documents explaining to us at all what happened to her. It's in your pocket. Put it in my pocket.
Yes, ma'am. I have another question. So the two boys that were like moaning up under the bed or whatever, did they live or did they die?
They lived.
And then my second question is, like, hypothetically, assuming they have a child in Cincinnati, would the child be considered free, or would they not because the mother was still a slave?
So that depends on who you ask, right? So if you're a slaver, then you're going to say it doesn't matter where she is, she's still a slave, and so the children follow the condition of the mother. If you ask an abolitionist, they're going to say, no, she's on free soil. That automatically makes her free, even though there's no record of emancipation, there's no one has bought her out of slavery. The abolitionists are going to say, yeah, the kid's free because she's always been free. So it just depends.
I appreciated both of these presentations, and they do have a shared theme. And I wanted to maybe ask you both to reflect on this, but I think it might relate more to your thesis, Susan, and that is, I personally have this idea that somehow one of the ways women don't stand up for each other, one of the reasons we don't speak out, for example, the recent case of the young woman on Facebook, is that it's self-protection. If we believe that only a woman who brought this upon herself has that happen to her, then we feel safe. And it's a fallacy, and it's not true. But it gives if we can blame her, we feel safe. And I see that kind of in a lot of the rhetoric around rape, and even our lack of response and sympathy to the victims of rape. So I wonder, in both cases, it's kind of the sympathy for the woman plays a huge part in how we as a society respond.
Now, traditionally, scholars have talked about the African American club women's movement as based in a middle class kind of experience in which African American women who are middle class try to represent respectability to the larger public because they don't want to be seen as Jezebels, Mammies, Sapphires, and those class tensions. And one problem within that has been that many black women did feel ashamed often to talk about the common experiences of sexual exploitation in a time when your value as a woman came through your personal virtue and chastity, right? So there has been talk about a culture of dissemblance, of trying to hide those issues. In fact, I actually think that that's been overblown, because when we see women talking out, people like Anna Julia Cooper, they're very clear, they're very direct about this. And so, to be sure, I mean, there is a tension there that for black women to speak out about rape exposes them to ridicule and humiliation, and it is a very difficult thing. Of course, most rapes to this day go unreported because of those issues. But there has been this tradition of speaking out and recognizing this that I actually think is empowering. I'm not in the position of a Ricci Taylor, but I mean, she was somebody who went to the police and tried to get justice. If she didn't get the formal kind of justice, I hope that she at least felt that she stood up for herself in the long run. And we don't have any records from her to know that. But I think that there are those alternate traditions that we could look to as perhaps a model for us today. If we hide it, we forget about it. If we speak up, the people who really hopefully will get shamed are the people who did those things, not us.
Harriet Jacobs kind of addresses that in her Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, where she describes the sexual pressure that she has. She describes her master as a predator who is always stalking her. And she speaks directly, if some of you have read that, I hope, to her audience of northern white women, saying essentially, look, you're free. You can have a home. You can have a husband. You can have children. Don't judge me because legally your system doesn't allow me to do those things. That's what I want, right? But your legal system puts me in this position of being chattel and at the whims of this man who can do whatever he wants to.
And she actually has some of the most important commentary about child abuse that I think we have seen even into the 21st century. So if we want to understand child abuse, we should read these historic texts. They tell us a lot about the power of abusers and the power of resistance, too.
If you don't know about Harriet Jacobs, her resistance was to go hide, and she hid in her grandmother's attic that was not insulated or anything, with a 1-inch peephole through which she watched her children play in the yard and grow up, and she hid there for 7 years. She could not sit up straight. She had frostbite. She shared it with mice, rats, whatever. 7 years she hid until she was sure the master would not be looking for her in that vicinity anymore.
In the back?
At night, now her children didn't know she was there. At night, her grandmother would lift the hatch and give her a little bit of candlelight sometimes and put food up for her in the night. Her grandmother and her uncle knew that she was there. And this was brilliant on her part, right? Because what's the first thing that a slave catcher is going to do? Slave catcher is going to pull out the dogs. If the dogs lead them straight to her grandmother's house, well, duh, of course her sin is at her grandmother's house. Right? So they have to discredit the dogs having led them there when that's where she is. It's really brilliant on her part.
I saw another hand over here, I think. Other questions? Thank you all so very much for coming out. We'll see you again in the spring.